Okay, great. Well, thank you everybody for logging in and joining us today. My name is Amanda Gumbert, and I'm an extension specialist for water quality with the University of Kentucky College of Agriculture, Food and Environment. And today we are going to talk about stream buffers. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we will get started. So just as an overview, what we're going to cover today, we're going to start out just talking basically about what stream buffers are and why stream buffers are important. And then finally, how can you establish stream buffers on your own property, or maybe some property where you volunteer or have some influence on. So what are stream buffers? Stream buffers are also called riparian zones. In forestry, we often call those streamside management zones. Some people maybe just simply call them buffer zones. But what they are is they're a transition area between a water body and an upland. So that can be a stream, it can be a pond, it can be a lake or a river. And what that zone looks like is in that graphic here on the slide. And that buffer zone would be that kind of brownish color. And obviously the blue is our moving stream. And so it might include the wetland, but you can see that it includes the floodplain. And in that stream buffer, the vegetation that we're looking for are trees, shrubs, grasses, and forbs. And a nice combination is always best. So sometimes we might think of stream buffers as zones, especially if we're working on larger stream buffer applications and we maybe are utilizing some cost share programs. The Natural Resources Conservation Service certainly uses the 3-zone stratification. And so to the far left of this graphic is our water body. And then in zone 1, we have larger trees. And those trees are important for providing shade to the stream. And also their large root systems help to hold the soil in place around that water body. And that's super important. We'll talk more about that as we move on. Zone 2 are our shrubs or smaller trees. And so they're also going to provide some canopy, but not quite as tall. And since they're farther away from the stream, they're not necessarily going to provide shading, but they're just going to give us some diversity in roots as well as canopy. And then our zone 3 are grasses and forbs. And that zone is what's going to border our upland land use. So if we have an agricultural field, or we maybe have a mowed lawn as our next land use away from the water body, that zone 3 is going to be that transition area. So I'll show you some pictures of what I would consider a healthy stream buffer. This is one that I took in Fayette County. Now this one doesn't have lots and lots of large trees or very mature trees, but it does have taller trees that are providing shading to the stream. And we have, it looks like some mixed vegetation in there. We do have some grasses that are close to the water's edge. But the important thing is that we're shading that stream and helping to regulate the water temperature. Now this stream buffer, I would also consider a healthy stream buffer. And obviously there's a lack of trees. Now that I will say that I prefer there to be trees there because we do need shading on the stream so that the water temperature doesn't get too hot. The reason we want to regulate water temperature is because things like mayfly larvae and stoneflies and caddisflies and all those little critters, the creepy crawlies that live under rocks, they don't like to be too hot. And so days like today and the last several days when it's been really hot, if you have a stream that is has direct sunlight on it, that water can get really too hot for those macroinvertebrates. And also warmer water doesn't hold as much dissolved oxygen as cooler water. And so even though this is to me a really pretty and functional stream buffer, and I would consider it healthy, I would like to see over time some larger trees that would provide shading. Just to let you know, this particular buffer was created in a passive manner. We're going to get into that in just a few minutes about how we establish buffers, but this was created with just a no-mow zone. And the things that you see coming up, some of you know what those plants are. Those came out of the seed bank. And while like the purple is ironweed, some folks don't like ironweed, but the yellow is a sneezeweed. The white blooms are boneset, which is a eupatorium, and the pink is swamp milkweed. And so those are things that are good for pollinators, and it's a diverse plant community, and that simply came from the seed bank. So unfortunately, this one is an unhealthy stream buffer. Obviously, this is a more urbanized stream, and lots of things going wrong with this stream. One, we have litter in the stream, and sometimes that's just a function of being in an urbanized area. Unfortunately, an adjacent landowner decided that they didn't like having to mow the stream, so they utilized a glyphosate product and killed all of the vegetation along the stream. And the person on the left side of the stream was mowing right to the edge of the stream. And so one thing that we try to prevent folks from doing is mowing straight to the edge of the stream, because when you have mowed lawn, you don't have a dense root system or a deep root system. And so the plants that are there are constantly trying to recover from being mowed. And so they aren't really functioning like they could to protect the stream. So we may have shallow rooted grasses, and you can see that there's some erosion with this stream. This is another example of what I would consider an unhealthy stream buffer. It's not the worst I've ever seen, but it does have vegetation. This happens to be in the winter, so lots of things are dormant. But if you're well versed in invasive species, you'll notice that the right bank of the stream does have winter creeper and honeysuckle that's growing there. The left bank doesn't have much vegetation. It is mowed up to the top part of the stream bank. And there's just not enough room because of the fence that's here to install much of a stream buffer to provide benefit to the water quality that's here. So this stream buffer needs a little bit of help. So now we're going to talk a little bit about why we love stream buffers, or maybe I should say why I love stream buffers. But hopefully by the end, I'll convince you why you should love stream buffers too. So healthy stream buffers provide lots of benefits. We call those ecosystem services. First and foremost, these buffer zones filter stormwater runoff. And so if we have a situation where we have a heavy rain and we have surface runoff coming from the adjacent land and landscape, the stream buffer is going to be a filter before that water and runoff gets into the stream. And so some of the things that that buffer can do is uptake excess nutrients that might be coming from adjacent areas. So if, like we have said, maybe we have a lawn that is next to the stream, and if we fertilize the lawn, we have a potential for losing some of those nutrients into the stream, and the buffer has the capacity to take up some of those excess nutrients. Same thing if we have this in an agricultural setting. We want to be able to uptake those excess nutrients, if possible, before they get in the stream. Also, having these roots nearby and on the stream bank protects the stream banks from erosion. I talk to a lot of landowners and homeowners who are concerned about their stream banks sloughing off, and they have 4 or 6 foot tall stream banks, and it's dangerous to have their equipment nearby. It's dangerous for small children or adults who may fall into the stream. And the reason that we lose soil on those stream banks is because a lot of times we mow right to the edge, or we farm right to the edge, or we maybe have constructed something right nearby the stream. And so there's nothing to hold the stream bank in place. So I'm a big soil person, and so I love having a diversity of roots that will hold soil in place. Buffers also reduce flood damage because they can store some of that water as well as uptake a lot of water. So you probably are familiar with trees. Trees are like little water pumps, and they can uptake water from the soil and pump it back out into the atmosphere. And so uptaking that water can help reduce downstream flood damage. Those trees also provide shade to the stream. And also, we haven't talked much about this, but stream buffers are very helpful for wildlife habitat. And the wildlife that we're talking about is a broad range of wildlife. So it could be a diversity of soil organisms that are living in that buffer, that are feeding on the root systems and the carbon that's in there. It could be small mammals, it could be birds, it could be butterflies, other pollinators, as well as small mammals, larger mammals. And so having a diverse plant community in our stream buffers certainly helps with wildlife habitat. And then finally, buffers really can improve the aesthetics of streams and stream areas. Some folks feel like they really like the look of a very well manicured lawn that includes mowing along the stream. I personally prefer what's shown here in this picture, and the black-eyed Susans are just beautiful when they all bloom together. And so having something that is more aesthetically pleasing than mowing to the edge also can provide those other ecosystem services that we talked about. So now let's talk about establishing our buffer zones. And we can do that in a couple of different ways. But some considerations that we should have are buffer width, our planting strategy, our maintenance strategy. Those things are exceptionally important. And also our visual desires or tolerance. So like I mentioned before, in terms of aesthetics, we all know that beauty is in the eyes of the beholder. And so some people might not have a tolerance, excuse me, for what they would consider to be more of a wild and woolly landscape. Also, sometimes we might have planning and zoning restrictions. There are a number of situations where neighborhood organizations, HOAs, might have restrictions on what can be planted where. Some cities have weed ordinances, but usually you can get a workaround to make sure that folks know you've intentionally planted things that might look weedy at certain times of the year. So our determining factors for establishing buffer zones really are the desired function we're looking for, how much time we've got, and then also what are our resources. And essentially our resources are our money and labor, right? So let's talk about buffer width. That's usually the big question that I get. People say, well, how much space do you really want to take? And so the answer that I usually give is I will take as much space as you give me for a stream buffer, because the width is going to determine the benefits that the buffer provides. Now, a minimum of 15 to 20 feet is ideal for stream bank protection. That would be our minimum distance, but water buffers are going to give us greater benefit. And so I say up to 160 feet. That's sometimes what we use in forestry practices, and especially when we have that kind of situation, if we're harvesting timber and we have an upslope disturbance, we want a water buffer if possible. And the wider the buffer, the greater benefit we get, and that would include some nutrient and pesticide removal from the runoff, as well as wildlife habitat. So this graphic kind of gives us an idea of how far away from the stream we need to go with our buffers to get specific benefits. So the minimum that's shown here is 10 feet. So 10 feet, that's about, if you have a 6-foot mower, and I'm thinking about zero-turn mowers, or even those that are a small tractor might pull, or that kind of thing. You're looking at a 6-foot mower, that's like 2 mower passes. And a lot of times when I talk to landowners, that's kind of the how I talk about it is, okay, so if you step back, 2 mower widths, or maybe now that we're very well versed in socially distancing, we know we're supposed to be 6 feet away, so like 2 social distances from the buffer or from the stream, and that would give us some basic benefit of stream bank stabilization and water temperature moderation. And remember that water temperature moderation was important for those small critters that are living under rocks and in the stream, and those are the base of the food web that is in the stream and the water body itself. Now, as we go farther away from the stream, the greater the benefit. So the wider the buffer, we might get more nutrient removal or more sediment control. As we get even farther away, we're going to get more flood control, where, a lot of times we might not really adhere to floodplains, and we kind of build in floodplains, or we crop in floodplains, or we have lawn in floodplains. And so having that flood control really is important for us because we need to respect the floodplain. And something I might mention too to keep in the back of your mind is our floodplains are going to fluctuate over time, and they have over time in terms of, in response to changes in our rainfall patterns. The more rainfall we get, a lot of times we're getting these really short bursts of high intensity rain events. Those are going to create more flooding situations. So considering that too, a water buffer could be helpful for downstream flooding. And then finally, wildlife habitat. Again, the wider the buffer, the better to provide these bigger corridors for wildlife. So now let's talk about some planting strategies. We can have a passive planting strategy, and that's just naturally allowing a buffer to establish using a no-mow zone. So we're going to get deeper detail into these two methods, but we can have a passive or we can have an active strategy. And the active strategy is really that deliberate planting of specific trees, shrubs, and grasses. So more of a landscaping type approach to establishing our stream buffer. So the passive approach is pretty easy. You just stop mowing. And for some people, that just runs chills up your spine. I grew up in a household that believed that we should mow and we should have a very well-groomed and manicured lawn, and stream that went through the side yard was also to be trimmed. So not mowing was not an option at the house I grew up in. So I can totally relate to that. It's pretty easy. Like I said, you just don't mow, and it's low maintenance, but only at first. So be cautious about that. It is inexpensive. You just utilize the existing seed bank, and then maybe there are some seeds that are dispersed by wind and water that would come in and populate that area. The problem though, the big problem with passive establishment is that we have unwanted plants that can establish and outcompete the things we want. So we're all very familiar with weeds and all the challenges with weeds, but especially in stream buffer areas that might become areas where we don't frequent as much. And so things like honeysuckle, winter creeper, multiflora rose, poison hemlock, garlic mustard, and the list goes on of non-native invasive plants that not just are unsightly or that we don't like, but there is some research also that some of those plants are detrimental to the ecosystem. So even though some people say, well, it's a plant, green is better than no green. While that can be true on in some respects, it's not always true when it comes to stream side buffers, because these nasty invasive plants are just no good. So this is an example of a passively established buffer. This is out at the Kentucky Horse Park in Fayette County. And this is an area that the stream doesn't flow all the time. It's an intermittent, and we just stopped mowing. There are some shrubs that were planted in this area, but pretty much it was a no-mow zone and just left that way. But the caution is this looks nice now because there's a nice edge of where the mowing boundary is. But this was one growing season of establishment. So after a few growing seasons, there are going to be some things that come in that we don't like. Same thing for this image. This is, I think, 2 seasons after establishing a no-mow zone. And so it looks really nice. There's lots of lush vegetation along that stream. But 10 years later, that area is populated with invasives. And the managers of this property are really frustrated because now it's become a maintenance headache, because we can't have all of these invasives that are in and near the stream and starting to encroach on the rest of the property. So passive establishment does have its downfall. An active establishment strategy includes creating a planting plan, removing any undesirable plants, stabilizing streams perhaps, or using some erosion control materials, very carefully selecting and installing those desirable plants, maintaining the plant communities, and caution that it is more expensive than passive, but perhaps in the long run, it could be a more beneficial approach because it may be easier to control unwanted plants in an actively planted strategy. Um, but caution also that it is time and labor intensive, especially up front, but perhaps that will work out over time. So here's an example of an area that this was a large planting area, and you can see where we used an herbicide we mowed down the grass and then used an herbicide application to kill the turf that we didn't want because we were trying to replace that bluegrass fescue mix with some other desirable plants. So we created a planting plan. You can see that the holes are strategically placed in the ground where those plants are going to go. And we got rid of the undesirable plants that we didn't want, and then we strategically selected the plants we did want. And here's a nice diagram of the types of plants that we put in this particular buffer area. At the bottom of the screen, we have willow live stakes, and those were harvested locally close to this project and installed in early spring. And we can talk a little more about willow stakes if you like. I don't want to go too far into that. But we also had perennial plugs, we had containerized shrubs, and also bald and burlapped tree, a couple of those. So again, this is all going to be dependent on what your budget looks like. You might decide that you want to go with a seed mix, and so there's a different strategy for establishing those plants using seeds versus plugs. So some of the constraints that you'll have with buffer establishment include first and foremost the appearance. Do you want it to be really manicured? Do you want it to maybe fall in the kind of the gray zone of what some of my colleagues call intentional wildness or curated native? That's kind of my favorite one. That one to me sounds more like a flower bed, but you're using native plants that you've carefully selected. And some of you maybe are okay with wild and woolly. I have a tolerance for wild and woolly and I'm okay with that, but I also know that it comes with some maintenance requirements that have to be done, and usually on an annual basis. So the appearance, what do you want? What do you want near your home? What is acceptable in your community? Maybe you're working in a park or a nature preserve and there's a different desire in that situation. What's the cost? That's going to be a big driver. It's much cheaper to buy seed than it is to buy perennial plugs. But sometimes we don't know how viable the seeds are. Are they going to like where we put them? Did we plant them at the right depth? All those considerations. And then finally, our maintenance. Do we have people available to help with maintenance, and are there maintenance costs associated? So in terms of plant selection, here's some of the publications that we've mentioned. I think you probably have seen these links before, but also these are University of Kentucky Extension publications. The Central Kentucky Backyard Stream Guide, don't be deterred by the fact that it says Central Kentucky. I worked with a few botanists to help with the plant list selection, and so a lot of those plants are specifically locally native to Central Kentucky, but they're all Kentucky native. So some botanists split hairs a little bit on what's native where in the landscape. So there's a planting list in all three of these publications. And then I would also say that the Lexington Fayette Urban County government created a plant by numbers program, and it's open to anyone. It's on their website and you can look at the resources they have. And there are plant lists based on light. So if you have a shady spot or if you have a really sunny spot, and also by moisture regime. So if you have an area that's more of a wetland, or if you have an area that's a little drier, so they can help you select plants. So I'll go through a few slides quickly over a few areas. I like to divide my plants into three kind of zones, and that's like the wetland plants. Those are ones that can be planted in the water or very near the water's edge. Black willow is one that we mentioned, or I mentioned that we used in the riparian planting that we did several years back. And the black willow is there on the far left of your screen. It's a medium-sized tree at maturity, you can harvest stakes, harvest pieces of the limbs from black willow, and then you harvest those and you can install those in the stream bank, and that's a way to propagate them inexpensively other than your labor. Buttonbush is a nice medium-sized shrub that also likes to have wet feet. Soft rush is probably one of my favorite plants because it's just a little bit different. Its bloom is somewhat understated, but it has a really nice form. And I just think rushes are really cool. It's a round stem and kind of spongy. If you squeeze the stem, you can feel the cells inside there. And then also I showed you earlier some pictures of swamp milkweed and boneset. And those are nice flowering plants that like to have their feet wet near the water's edge. And then we've got moisture tolerant plants, and those are ones that can be planted right on the stream bank or up to about 5 feet away. So their roots can find the water that they need. So examples of those might be sycamore, rough leaf dogwood, and then things that bloom and are pretty. Great blue lobelia and cardinal flower are two nice ones that can handle. They're moisture tolerant, but then also can dry out a little bit and be okay. And then plants that you can put about 5 feet away from the water's edge that are moderate to dry soil plants. These are some of my favorites. Redbud, of course, gives us a nice bloom early in the spring. And little blue stem is a nice native grass that gives us lots of soil benefits, as well as very tolerant of being dry further away from the stream. And then to give a little burst of color, Black-eyed Susan are really forgiving and easy, and wild bergamot or bee balm. This has been a great year for our bee balm. We have a huge swath of that, and it's just been really beautiful this year. So some things to remember in your design elements. Think ahead. Think about how big your trees and shrubs will be at maturity. So let them fill their space, but give them space as you plant them. And so thinking in 3 dimensions, horizontally, vertically, and as well as where they are physically, away from the stream. Think about your preferences, color preferences, seasonal interest, texture, shape. I mentioned I like soft rush as a different texture in the landscape. And then thinking about mass planting things together that will give you large swaths of color. If you really like kind of that wild and woolly look, but your neighbor doesn't, or you need to somehow make another person happy who is involved in your project, sometimes having large swaths of color or little pockets of color that are very intentional help folks be more accepting of stream buffers that don't look quite as manicured as the rest of a lawn might. So making sure you maintain your stream buffer. So inspect your stream and your stream buffer regularly, especially after storm events. Go and check it out. Did things get knocked over? Did you get litter? Does it need to be removed? Check on the invasive plants. Remove those annually at least, if not more than once a year. And also remember, you probably need to prune some trees and shrubs so that they don't get too overgrown, and know that things will start to, even though in a very strategically planted buffer, nature will take its course and things will start to fill in areas, and some things may outcompete other things. So just being tolerant and aware of that. And then also removing the previous year's growth from perennials. Personally, I like to wait until late winter or early spring to do that, so that we give cover for overwintering insects, and the seeds stay there through the winter as well for habitat. I just like to leave that growth. Some folks don't like how it looks because it looks kind of scraggly, but some plants have really beautiful winter structure and can be really attractive as well. So the last a couple more things. If you're interested in learning more about backyard streams and how streams work and how you can be a better stream steward, we have an online course that is free and available for you to sign up for. And you can go to this website and sign up for that. Once you complete the course, you will be a certified backyard stream steward. So I encourage you to take advantage of that. On this website, there are also a couple of videos of some other homeowners who have been inspired by wanting to be a better stream steward, and they tell their stories of how they've improved their landscape. And then also we have a water podcast. So if you're interested in more topics related to water quality, I encourage you to tune in to our KYH2O podcast. It's available on iTunes or Podbean or wherever you get your podcasts. And so with that, I will stop sharing and entertain some questions if we have time.